Be Me 34, HR manager at a technology consulting firm with 220 employees across software development, project management, client service, and operations. Had strong feminist beliefs about workplace equality, passionate about making men uncomfortable as necessary steps toward dismantling patriarchy. Posted frequently on social media about how men needed to be constantly challenged and called out for their complicity and oppression, believed that creating discomfort for male employees was productive feminist HR practice, forcing them to confront their privilege. Got promoted to HR manager specifically because the company wanted an aggressive approach to diversity and inclusion after industry criticism. One of my first priorities was implementing what I called accountability sessions, where workplace behaviors were examined through feminist lens, started quarterly mandatory training sessions focused on male privilege, toxic masculinity, and men's complicity in patriarchal systems, posted on social media about a bold new training program, making men squirm, and forcing uncomfortable conversations about male behavior. First accountability session focused on interrupting and misplanning, with examples drawn from actual workplace meetings, showed video clips from recent all-hands meeting highlighting times when men had interrupted women or explained concepts condescendingly. Senior project manager named Stephen, who was 41, had interrupted a female colleague once during a 90-minute meeting to ask clarifying questions. I played a clip of his interruption multiple times, asking the group to analyze what made this typical example of male dominance. Stephen seemed uncomfortable, saying he'd asked a question because he was confused, not because he was trying to dominate. I said intent didn't matter. Impact was that he'd interrupted women, which reinforced patriarchal patterns of male voices taking priority, that his defensiveness about being called out proved exactly why these accountability sessions were necessary for men. Several male employees looked visibly uncomfortable, while some female employees seemed uncertain about whether the example was fair. Continued session by having all men in room practice apologizing for interrupting women. Even if they claimed they hadn't done it, said collective apology was important because all men benefited from culture of interruption, even if individually they were mindful. Software developer named Marcus, who was 38, asked if women ever interrupted men or if interrupting was exclusively male behavior. I said while women might occasionally interrupt, the systemic pattern of men interrupting women was what mattered for this discussion. His question was deflection, attempting to avoid accountability by pretending gender patterns didn't exist in the workplace. Marcus seemed frustrated but didn't push back further after being characterized as deflecting from important conversation. Second accountability session focused on emotional labor, with emphasis on how men expected women to manage workplace relationships. Showed examples of women employees organizing birthday celebrations, mediating conflicts, and remembering personal details about colleagues. Asked male employees to reflect on times they'd benefited from women's emotional labor without reciprocating or acknowledging it. Operations manager named Derek, who was 35, said he always thanked colleagues who organized events and tried to contribute when possible. I said thanks wasn't enough. Men needed to proactively take on emotional labor rather than waiting to be asked or just expressing gratitude. That Derek's claim, he tried to contribute when possible, suggesting emotional labor was optional for him while mandatory for women. Derek asked what specifically I wanted him to do differently if thanking and contributing when asked wasn't sufficient. I said he needed to figure that out himself because asking women to explain emotional labor was itself another form of emotional labor. That men expecting women to educate them about how to be better was a perfect example of how patriarchy operated in the workplace. Derek looked confused and frustrated by being criticized for both not doing enough and for asking how to do more. Third accountability session focused on tone policing and how men dismissed women's legitimate anger by calling them emotional. Shared examples from the workplace where men had characterized women's direct communication as aggressive or overly emotional. Sales director named Andrew, who was 44, had once described a female colleague's email as a bit intense during team discussion. I presented this as textbook tone policing, where men felt entitled to judge a woman's communication style and demand she moderate tone. Andrew said he described the email as intense because it had been all caps with multiple exclamation points. Not because Cinder was a woman. I said his focus on style rather than content was exactly how men dismissed women's legitimate concerns by critiquing their delivery, that men like Andrew were socialized to expect women to communicate in soft, non-threatening ways and reacted negatively when they didn't. Andrew seemed angry, saying he'd been commenting on specific emails, not making statements about all women's communication. I said his anger at being called out for tone policing proved how fragile men became when their behavior was examined. Fourth accountability session focused on taking credit for women's work and ideas with examples from recent project retrospectives. Showed a meeting transcript where male project lead had presented a solution that the female team member had originally suggested. An engineering manager named Patrick, who was 39, had presented an architecture approach that a junior female engineer had proposed in a prior meeting. I characterized this as typical male behavior appropriating women's intellectual labor. While taking credit and recognition, Patrick said he'd explicitly credited the junior engineer in his presentation and had invited her to co-present, but she declined. I said performative crediting didn't undo damage of him being one presenting, while woman's contribution was minimized to acknowledgement. That structural patriarchy meant Patrick's voice carried more weight. So, even with credit, the idea became his in organizational memory. Patrick asked what he should have done differently if crediting the originator and inviting co-presentation weren't appropriate. I said he needed to examine why he'd felt entitled to present a woman's idea, even with credit, rather than stepping back entirely, that his question about what to do differently showed he didn't understand the fundamental problem with male centrality in the workplace. These quarterly sessions became increasingly focused on identifying specific male employees' behaviors as examples of patriarchal patterns, would show video clips, read emails, or describe interactions with enough detail that individuals were clearly identifiable, then facilitate group discussion analyzing how highlighted behavior exemplified toxic masculinity or male privilege, posted on social media about productive discomfort. Accountability sessions were created as men faced their complicity, got supportive responses from feminist HR professionals praising bold approach to making male behavior visible and challengeable. One commenter said, "This is exactly what accountability looks like, even when men claim they're being unfairly targeted." Another said, "Men's discomfort is a sign you're doing important work. Keep pushing even when they complain about being singled out, and start receiving complaints from male employees," saying accountability sessions felt like public shaming for normal workplace behavior. Stephen, who'd been featured for asking clarifying questions, said being singled out for interrupting once in 9 zero-minute meetings seemed excessive, that having his behavior analyzed by the entire company made him afraid to speak in meetings in case he was featured again. I said discomfort was productive, and if he was afraid to interrupt, that meant sessions were working as intended. Marcus, who'd asked about women interrupting, said he felt targeted for asking legitimate questions about gender patterns, that characterizing his question as deflection had shut down actual discussion about whether patterns were as one-sided as presented. I said his continued focus on defending his question proved he wasn't willing to examine his own defensive reactions. Derek, who'd been criticized for asking how to help, said he felt like he couldn't do anything right in the accountability framework. That thanking wasn't enough. Asking how to help was a burden, and apparently just figuring it out himself also wasn't acceptable. I said his frustration was a typical male response to finally being held accountable after a lifetime of avoiding responsibility. Andrew, who'd been featured for calling an intense email session, had made him hesitant to give any feedback about communication That fear of being accused of tone policing meant he now avoided necessary conversations about professional communication standards. I said if he was moderating his communication policing, that was a positive outcome. Even if he experienced it as restrictive, Patrick, who'd been shown presenting the woman's idea, said he'd stopped presenting anything in meetings to avoid being accused of appropriation. That accountability session had made him afraid his contributions would be characterized as taking credit regardless of actual behavior. I said if patriarchy made his voice carry more weight, then stepping back from presenting was exactly what accountability required. 6 months into quarterly accountability sessions, started receiving formal complaints to the CEO about a hostile work environment. 5 male employees submitted joint complaint, stating sessions had created an environment where men were publicly shamed for normal behavior. That being featured in sessions with identifying details made them afraid to participate fully in the workplace for fear of being the next example. And that I had posted on social media about making men squirm, which showed intent to create a hostile environment and not educate. CEO called a meeting asking about complaints that accountability sessions were targeting and shaming male employees. I explained sessions were necessary, feminist intervention, making male privilege visible through real workplace examples. CEO said several featured employees claimed their normal professional behavior had been characterized as toxic masculinity. That posting about making men uncomfortable suggested I was creating discomfort as a goal rather than a byproduct of education. I said men's discomfort with accountability was expected resistance to dismantling patriarchal workplace structures. CEO said complaints alleged a specific pattern of singling out male employees for public criticism in mandatory company sessions. That if sessions were creating an environment where men felt unable to participate normally, that could be a hostile workplace legally. Asked if I'd considered using hypothetical examples rather than identifying specific employees' actual workplace behaviors, I said using real examples was more effective because hypotheticals let men distance themselves from actually examining behavior. That features specific behaviors made accountability concrete rather than abstract theoretical discussion. Men could ignore 7 months into accountability sessions, receive notice that 7 male employees had filed EOC complaints against the company. Complaints stated I had created a hostile work environment for men through systematic public criticism in mandatory training sessions. That featuring specific male employees' normal behaviors as examples of toxic masculinity constituted harassment based on gender. Evidence included my social media posts about making men squirm and creating productive discomfort through accountability, and testimony from featured employees that being singled out had made them afraid to participate normally in the workplace. Most concerning was the legal argument that using real examples with identifying details in mandatory sessions was public humiliation. Company attorney reviewed the complaint and evidence with serious concern, saying the case had legitimate grounds, that my posts about making men uncomfortable showed intent to create a hostile environment, not just educate about gender dynamics. I said discomfort was a necessary part of accountability, and men claiming harassment proved they couldn't handle being challenged. Attorney said, regardless of my intent, repeatedly singling out male employees for public criticism could constitute gender-based harassment. Using mandatory training sessions to feature and criticize specific employees created a captive audience for humiliation, and that pattern of targeting only male employees' behaviors while presenting them as examples of systemic male problems was discriminatory. 8 months into the accountability session, CEO mandated immediate suspension of the program pending legal review. The EEOC complaint alleged systematic harassment of male employees through public shaming and mandatory sessions. That my social media posts about making men squirm had created evidence of discriminatory intent in program design, and that 7 employees claiming a hostile environment required serious investigation before continuing any accountability sessions. I felt betrayed that feminist accountability work was being characterized as harassment and discrimination against men. posted on social media about companies suspending accountability programs because men couldn't handle being held responsible, got supportive responses from some feminists, but also significant criticism from HR professionals, saying I'd crossed legal lines. One HR attorney commented, "Using real employee examples in mandatory training is legally problematic, regardless of educational intent." Another commented, "Your posts about making men squirm are evidence of discriminatory motives that the EOC will use against the company." 9 months after beginning accountability sessions, sat in EEOC mediation, listening to featured employees describe impact. Stephen said being featured for asking a single clarifying question had made him afraid to speak in any meeting. That video of his interruption had been played multiple times, with the group analyzing his male dominance and entitlement. He'd become so anxious about being featured again that his participation in projects had decreased, affecting his performance. Marcus said being told his question was deflection in front of the entire company had felt like public humiliation, that I characterized him as resistant to accountability for asking if interrupting patterns were actually gendered. As claimed, he'd stopped asking any questions in company sessions for fear of being labeled defensive or fragile. Again, Derek said being criticized for both not helping and asking how to help had created an impossible double bind. That accountability session had told him thanks wasn't enough. Asking was a burden, but figuring it out alone was also wrong. He'd withdrawn from organizing any team events because couldn't navigate contradictory expectations without being featured. Andrew said being presented as an example of tone policing for calling specific email intents had made him avoid all feedback. That session had characterized his comment about one message as representing how all men dismissed women's communication. He'd stopped giving any feedback about communication style to avoid being accused of policing women's legitimate anger. Patrick said being shown presenting the woman's idea despite crediting her and inviting co-presentation had felt deeply unfair. That session had characterized his behavior as appropriation, even though he'd done everything he could think of to credit the originator. That session had characterized his behavior as appropriation. Even though he'd done everything he could think of to credit the originator, he'd stopped presenting anything in meetings because, apparently, even with proper credit, his participation was problematic appropriation. Listening to employees describing becoming afraid to participate normally in the workplace made a clear impact on accountability sessions. EEOC mediator noted a pattern of employees modifying normal professional behavior to avoid being featured in my sessions. Creating an environment where employees were afraid to ask questions, give feedback, or present work was a textbook hostile environment. 10 months after beginning sessions, the company settled the AOC complaint for $450. 000 distributed among 7 complainants. Settlement included agreement to permanently discontinue accountability sessions and revise training to use only hypothetical examples. And my termination as HR manager for creating a hostile work environment through discriminatory public shaming sessions also included agreement that I would not post about complainants on social media or characterize them in any public forum. Board approved a settlement saying $450, 000, plus my termination was necessary to resolve the complaint and restore workplace function. Felt devastated that feminist accountability work had been characterized as discrimination, resulting in $500,000 settlement. Posted general statement about being terminated for holding men accountable without naming specific employees per settlement. Got very mixed responses, with feminist supporters saying I'd been punished for threatening patriarchy, but also significant criticism from HR professionals and employment attorneys saying I'd engaged in obvious gender-based harassment. One attorney commented, featuring employees by name in mandatory sessions where behavior is criticized is harassment regardless of intent. Another commented, your social media posts about making men squirm prove discriminatory motives. Making settlement inevitable. Started therapy to process termination and settlement. trying to understand how accountability had become harassment lawsuits, therapist asked me to describe what I'd hoped to achieve by featuring specific male employees in mandatory accountability sessions. I said I'd wanted to make patriarchal patterns visible and concrete by showing real examples from the actual workplace. She asked if I'd considered how employees would feel being singled out and criticized in front of the entire company. I was quiet because I'd focused on educational value, not impact on featured employees who were made examples. She said, "It sounds like you'd used real people's workplace behaviors for feminist education without considering the effect on them. That Stephen being featured for asking one question had made him afraid to participate, which was the opposite of accountability. That creating fear of being featured had made employees withdraw from the workplace rather than examine their behavior. This was a painful realization that I'd created a hostile environment while believing I was creating accountability. Year after beginning accountability sessions, reflected on how feminist training had become $450. 000 harassment settlement. Realized biggest mistake had been featuring specific, identifiable employees rather than using hypothetical examples. That Stephen, Marcus, Derek, Andrew, Patrick, and others had been used as teaching tools without considering impact on them. And that posting about making men squirm had created evidence of discriminatory intent rather than education, national purpose, started consulting work, helping companies implement diversity training without creating hostile environments. Main message was that my approach of featuring real employees by name had crossed the line from education to harassment, that accountability could be created through hypothetical examples without singling out individuals for public criticism. One consulting client had been planning training using video clips of actual employee meetings, similar to my sessions. My experience convinced them to use actors and scripts instead of avoiding hostile environments created by featuring real people. Another client had a trainer who posted on social media about making privileged groups uncomfortable during sessions. Help them understand those posts created evidence of discriminatory intent that could be used in harassment complaints. 2 years after settlement, published article about experience titled, "My Accountability Sessions Became Harassment Lawsuit." Detailed how I'd featured specific male employees in mandatory training, creating hostile environment through public criticism, that 7 employees had filed EOC complaint, and company had settled for $450. 000 plus my termination, and that posting about making men squirm had provided evidence of discriminatory intent in program design. Article went viral in the HR community with over 500K reads. An intense debate about accountability versus harassment. Many HR professionals appreciated cautionary tales about how diversity training could create hostile environments. One HR director commented, "An essential warning about using real employee examples in mandatory training, regardless of educational value." Another comment, "On your social media posts about making men uncomfortable, proved discriminatory motive, making settlement necessary." But some feminists criticized the article, saying I'd capitulated to the patriarchal system, punishing women for accountability work. 3 years after settlement, ran into Stephen, who'd been the first employee featured for asking clarifying questions. He said being featured for a single interruption had been humiliating and had made him anxious about participating. That settlement had validated his complaint that being singled out for normal behavior created a hostile environment. He'd eventually recovered confidence, but being made an example had damaged his workplace relationships and performance. I apologized for featuring him publicly without considering the impact of being criticized in front of the entire company. He said he hoped my consulting work prevented other HR professionals from using real employees as teaching tools. That his case had become an example in employment law courses about how diversity training could create hostile environments. For years after settlement, published a book about experience wanting to help HR professionals implement effective training. Detailed complete story from accountability sessions to featuring employees to EOCC, complaint to settlement, included legal analysis of how public criticism of identifiable employees in mandatory sessions constituted harassment and framework for accountability training using hypothetical examples rather than real employees' behaviors. Book became required reading in HR programs as a case study about diversity training creating hostile environments. 5 years after settlement, reflected on complete transformation from accountability advocate to cautionary tale, realized that featuring Stephen, Marcus, Derek, Andrew, Patrick, and others had prioritized my educational goals over their dignity. That posting about making men squirm had revealed discriminatory intent rather than legitimate educational purpose. And that $450 000 settlement plus my termination had been appropriate for creating hostile environment through public shaming. Current reflection: 7 years after Rage, baiting male employees and facing lawsuits for hostile workplace, learned that featuring specific employees in mandatory sessions was harassment regardless of feminist educational intent, that Stephen's fear of being featured again had made him withdraw, which was a hostile environment, not accountability, that posting about making men uncomfortable had provided evidence of discriminatory motives in training design, that $450 000 settlement for 7 employees was appropriate given systematic public shaming in mandatory sessions. Most importantly, that accountability training should use hypothetical examples, not real employees, as teaching tools. That's what I learned from rage-baiting male employees through accountability sessions and facing harassment lawsuits. From featuring real employees to understanding that was public humiliation, not education. From making men squirm to recognizing that created a hostile environment, not accountability. That's my complete story about accountability sessions becoming harassment, lawsuit, and settlement. 7 years after settlement, continued consulting, helping companies implement training without hostile environments. Most impactful work involved HR professionals recognizing themselves, planning to feature real employees in sessions. One HR director had been creating a video compilation of male employees meeting behaviors for training. After hearing a complete story that would create a hostile environment and switch to scripted examples, another trainer had been posting on social media about making privileged groups uncomfortable during sessions. Help them understand those posts created evidence of discriminatory intent if employees filed complaints. 8 years after settlement, published follow-up research on diversity training and hostile environment claims. 200 companies compared training using hypothetical examples versus real employee behaviors. Found that training featuring real employees had a 400% higher rate of hostile environment complaints. That employees who'd been featured reported decreased participation and increased anxiety about workplace interactions. Research validated that featuring Stephen and others had predictably created a hostile environment despite educational intent. 9 years after settlement, Stephen, who'd been featured for asking questions, published an article about experience, describing how being publicly criticized for single interruption had affected his confidence and workplace relationships. That settlement had validated his experience of being featured as creating a hostile environment, not accountability. He emphasized that accountability could happen without public humiliation of specific employees in mandatory sessions. Article became widely cited in discussions about implementing diversity training without creating hostile environments. Current reflection: 10 years after Rage baiting male employees and settling harassment lawsuits, learning that decade of helping companies avoid featuring real employees gave meaning to my settlement. That Stephen, Marcus, Derek, Andrew, Patrick, and others had legitimate complaints about public criticism. That posting about making men squirm had been evidence of discriminatory intent, not educational purpose. That $450 000 settlement plus termination were appropriate for systematic harassment through mandatory sessions. Most importantly, that accountability training must protect employee dignity, not create fear through public shaming. That's everything learned from 10 years, since accountability sessions became harassment lawsuits and settlements, from featuring real employees to understanding that was harassment regardless of feminist intent, from making men uncomfortable as gold to recognizing that it created a hostile environment, not education. That's my final lesson about rage-baiting male employees and learning why public shaming isn't accountability. 10 years after settlement, continued consulting work, helping organizations distinguish between education and public humiliation. Most powerful sessions involve trainers recognizing themselves, planning to use real employee examples for accountability. One diversity consultant had been developing training featuring actual workplace emails with sender names visible. After hearing the complete story about the $450,000 settlement, I understood that identifying real employees created harassment liability. Revised approaches using composite fictional examples that taught the same concepts without targeting actual individuals. Training received positive feedback from employees who learned about patterns without fear of being featured. Another HR team had been recording meeting footage, planning to show examples of problematic behaviors in sessions, worked with them on understanding employees would recognize themselves and colleagues. Creating a hostile environment, they abandoned recording plans and developed scripted role plays, teaching the same material without humiliating real people. 11 years after settlement, published a comprehensive guide for accountability training without hostile environments, detailed framework distinguishing between systemic education and individual targeting in diversity training design. Included my case as a primary example of how featuring identifiable employees crossed from education to harassment and legal analysis, showing why my social media posts about making men squirm proved discriminatory intent. Guide became a standard resource for HR professionals and trainers developing programs that educated without creating liability, started training corporate trainers specifically about legal boundaries between challenging ideas and targeting individuals. One workshop participant had been planning to show screenshots of male employees' Slack messages in gender training. After understanding my settlement resulted from a similar approach, she redesigned using fictional message examples. Instead, her revised training taught about problematic communication patterns without making any employee feel publicly shamed. Another trainer had been collecting stories of specific employee behaviors to use as teaching examples in sessions, helped him recognize that even anonymized stories could be identified by details. Creating the same hostile environment, he switched to purely hypothetical scenarios, losing none of educational value, while eliminating harassment risk. 12 years after settlement, all 7 complainants had rebuilt careers. Though some still carried effects of being featured, Stephen said being publicly criticized for asking questions had created lasting anxiety about speaking up in meetings. Settlement compensation had helped, but couldn't undo damage of being made an example in front of the entire company. Marcus reported similar lasting hesitation to ask questions even in a new workplace due to being labeled defensive. Derek, Andrew, and Patrick all described permanent changes to how they participated to avoid similar public criticism. Their collective experiences became case studies in employment law courses about hostile environments through training programs. Current reflection, 13 years after rage-baiting male employees in accountability sessions leading to lawsuits, learned that 13 years of helping companies avoid my mistakes gave me some redemption for creating a hostile environment. That featuring Stephen for asking questions and Marcus for questioning had been public humiliation, not education. That posting about making men squirm had been evidence of discriminatory intent, making settlement inevitable. That $450 settlement, plus my termination, were appropriate consequences for systematic harassment in mandatory sessions. Most importantly, that accountability education must challenge systems and ideas, not publicly shame specific individuals